Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, back in the host seat after last week. The voice is not quite 100%, but it's a lot better than it was. Thank you to Peter Johnson and Jason Vogt, who already in the comments are busting my chops about being on time. But you know what? It has felt like the longest wait to start the show. I know all our friends in Saskatchewan have no idea what we're talking about, but for everybody else, it's really late. It's 9, but it's 8. I don't know how we're going to do this, but we're going to try. And no, it is the real me, Jason. It is. Shout out hello to Kevin and to Ray. Um, and I see all my friends. This is wonderful. Okay, so I'm really excited about tonight's chat. I think it's going to be a good one. But of course, before we get to that, quick reminder to everybody following along tonight, let us know that you watched the show and get those CEU credits. Head over to realagriculture.com/agronomist. Tomorrow morning, we'll have this post ready. Just let us know you watched the program and you can collect those credits. I did want to also, of course, we are live every Monday night, 8 p.m. In 2 weeks from now, on November 21st, we are very much going to be focused on nitrogen management, and that is going to be a knowledge sharing event. So a KSE for those of you who have been going through any of that off-CAF funding and need that. So just a quick note about that. There'll be more information about that coming up, but mark your calendars. Nitrogen management, 2 weeks from now. Okay. I do want to, of course, thank our wonderful sponsors for making this show happen. Our show sponsors are ADAMA Canada, Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, and the Disruptors podcast. Thank you to ADAMA Canada. Right? Is that, sorry, Jay? Is that the one we're doing? I think so. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. While other sources of innovation run dry and fail to understand your needs, ADAMA is here to deliver, and we're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today. I grabbed the wrong paper. Okay, let's get going on the show. Tonight, joining me, two Manitobans. So I'm pretty pleased about this, I won't lie. We've got Jeanette Gaultier with BASF and Rob Bahry of ADAMA Canada. Welcome here, Rob. Hello, Jeanette.
Hi, Lyndsey.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Okay. All right. Okay. So now, Rob, this is your second time on the show. So welcome back. Jeanette, you're well featured in our school episodes, but I think this is your first agronomists.
It is. I kind of feel like I'm cheating on Kelvin.
You know what? So there you go. Calvin doesn't get to hog all the great people. Okay. So tonight, our topic is clever chemistries, tackling the toughest to kill weeds. And this is sort of inspired by a few things, of course. I think this past year we saw maybe for the very first time a bit of a scramble potentially for some products. It all worked out okay, but there was definitely, I think, for the first time in my memory anyway, some panic buying, some what are we going to be able to get our hands on, these sorts of things. And of course, we've got the ever increasing risk of herbicide resistance. And so you couple those things together and we have to get creative. So that sort of inspired some of the discussion tonight. But Rob, I want to start with, and I feel like it's not quite a disclaimer, it's more a mention that we are focusing tonight, yes, on chemistry, but that doesn't, of course, completely get rid of integrated pest management. We know this is just a part. So, um, Jay, if you could bring up Rob's slide 33. And Rob, if you could just, in a nutshell, sort of bring in where or thinking about weed control in an integrated pest management strategy.
Sure. Thanks, Lyndsey. And thanks again for inviting me back to the show. Once again, I'm Rob Bahry, Development Manager for ADAMA in Canada, based here out of Winnipeg. Still above zero for another day or two, and then I guess winter's really going to hit. But yeah, to your question there, Lyndsey, I think we need to think of weed management in a holistic approach. We think of field by field and application by application, but even beyond that, I'd encourage people to think of it as a long-term rotational approach, your 4-year or even longer rotation. What crop am I going to grow this year and the next year, and thinking of that in mind, what herbicides are going to fit best in that crop rotation, taking into account the tough to kill weeds that I need to use some more specialized herbicides that may have some residual properties that may affect my crop rotation decisions the following year. So I think we need to take a holistic approach to weed control, and not just field by field or year to year, but really as part of your whole 4-year crop rotation. And
Jeanette,
of course, within that, there's the cropping diversity and using forages where you can, or breaking up the cycle from just seeding in the spring to using fall rye or fall or winter wheat when appropriate to help mix up when you're harvesting, cutting those weeds, and spraying the application timing.
We're going to talk a little bit about that, sort of working with or trying to make the most of how weeds grow and the things they don't like. So Jeanette, how do you sort of tackle this question when you're working with growers as to how to work in other things beyond just herbicide control into weed control?
Yeah, I definitely enjoy being the corn and soybean point person here in Manitoba, and so definitely get to talk a lot about and seeing it in other crops too, but talking about plant populations and row spacings, and even starting to see a lot more rye going down, using that cover crop as weed suppression as well. So all those things that we're either coming up with uniquely for the prairies or pilfering from others like Ontario or North Dakota, it's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Beg, borrow, and steal. It's fine. Just that's how we
Absolutely.
learn. And certainly there are some major differences, of course, between East and West, but lessons we can learn across. Did want to say, so good morning from Nigeria. So we have someone watching from Nigeria. It's 2 a.m. there. So if we think we're tired, there you go. Okay. Yeah. So, and Jason pointing out corn and soybeans are definitely sexy in Manitoba this year. I did hear a rumor that, and I don't know if it's been confirmed, but perhaps record soybean yield tonnage in Manitoba this year.
Pretty awesome. I can't wait to see it. I
Yeah.
definitely feel
Yeah.
like, soybeans probably out yielded canola this year. So it's
Mm-hmm.
great. Good. It's nice
Yeah,
to have the crop rotation.
absolutely. Okay. Let's dig into so a couple of things we're going to talk about tonight. So by all means, in the comments, send your questions. So if you've got some of those questions on some of those tough to kill weeds, send them along. But we are going to dig into things to think about with our chemistry mixing. We're going to talk about timing for sure. We're going to talk about herbicide layering, and this is, I think, a key one that we can dig into. But Rob, maybe I'll start with you. When I think we've got some good slides, but we'll go off. What is sort of your base for putting together that plan for the toughest to kill weeds? Which ones are you targeting? How do you put that plan together?
Yeah, again, I think it starts with that holistic cultural agronomic approach. So growing, a diversity of crops, the best crops that can fit into your particular situation. Growing strong crops that will compete with those weeds. Scouting, herbicide record keeping, all of those agronomic cultural factors in addition to your actual herbicide regime. I think when it comes to the tougher to control weeds, really weed control in general, it's herbicide layering and herbicide mixing. So layering, of course, we're talking about the use of multiple herbicide groups and actives at different application timings to control the same weeds. So I think of 4 key application timings in the growing season, starting with post-harvest weed control, your spring burn down, your in-crop, which can be both early and a little bit later, depending on when the weeds emerge, and some pre-harvest weed control, particularly for perennials. So herbicide layering, it would start with that, and then using appropriate herbicide mixtures when it makes sense to help manage herbicide resistance and keep the herbicide weeds at bay the best that you can.
Jeanette, in thinking sort of that time of year strategy, but also thinking about tank mixing, are you seeing an increased interest in figuring out the time of year, or are we still very focused on what else can I throw in the tank?
Starting to see a shift, I think. And I don't know, maybe it depends on the year a bit too. I mean, last year was a bit of a slow start for Manitoba, so everything was compressed. But at the same time, I feel like in other parts of the West, with glyphosate maybe being short, whether it was or not, I don't know, it's kind of hard to say. But I think that was really great to see, people looking at other options and then trying it out and saying, wow, this really works. And I do feel like we do steal things from other places, but maybe our reasoning is a little bit different, but it still works here. Like in Ontario or our neighbors to the south, talking about layering or overlapping residual chemistries, not really an option here. Rob kind of alluded to crop rotation, and we have to be careful with our products here. But on the same token, lots of cool season weeds here that are getting the jump on our crop before we get in there. Definitely that shift to minimum till, no till. So, just taking that focus away from just trying to tackle everything at one time with our in crop timing to actually hitting it with a 1-2 punch. And I think it's really been working out in farmers' favor.
Hmm. So key point there, Rob. I mean, you've been at this a long time. Um, have you seen what maybe has been one of the weeds that has surprised you the most and how much of a problem it still is?
Um, you know, Wild oats, I mean, it's still a top five weed in Western Canada, and we've seen resistance developing for over, 30 years now? Yeah, 91, I think we first saw it in Swan River area of Manitoba. And, in some respects, it's still a great story that we can still have group ones and even group twos that are still acceptable in a lot of cases. But it's definitely one of those weeds that forced us into thinking about this layering and holistic approach. You know, um, 20, 30 years ago, it was like a triolate or a group one, for example. You never thought of doing both. Now, I think it's more of a common practice to consider putting down a triolate in the fall, for example, and then come back with a pre-seed, even in areas where you cultivate, like the Red River Valley, with the glyphosate. And then if there's still wild oats in crop, then come back with a group one or possibly group two. So, in that example with wild oats now, we're maybe looking to hit them 3 times: fall, burn down, and in crop as an example. Um,
Yeah.
Kosha is another one that's become very problematic with group two and glyphosate resistance, and same type of concept. Minimize the population in the fall the best you can, burn down with some group 14, group 15, and in crop, less options in pulses, but there's still some options available.
Yeah, so kosha is one that Jeanette, I'll ask you as well. What have you been having the best success with as far as chemistries?
That one is definitely best hit with multiple timings and multiple chemistries. Group fours are really strong on kosha, but I think maybe a bit of a cautionary note in just relying on group fours is that, of course, we're starting to see that resistance pop up and even a little bit of cross resistance too. If we're using our dicamba in our soybeans or wherever else, and then our fluroxapyr and our wheat, just making sure that we are trying to work some more chemistries in so that we aren't just putting all the pressure on those group fours. And so then, maybe not quite as effective as our dicambas, for example, but once you start layering in those group 14s, those group 27s, if you can get some activity from uh, I would say some of the oldies but goodies. Sometimes when you do mix them in with some of these newer, I use the air quotes, newer modes of action, we do see some really complementary activity on kosha. So here, I really do think that's an excellent weed to use as an example of thinking outside the box when it comes to chemistry.
So that's maybe a key point, Rob, and you're nodding your head along with this. Are we seeing, reaching back to some of those oldie but goodies and bringing them back into the mix more so than maybe in past years?
Definitely, we still get questions on can we bring Avenge back? Is it possible? And short answer is not likely. But yes, some of those oldies but goodies, are being asked about given the resistance management issues. Just a quick comment on Jeanette's point. I like the comment about the fluroxapyr, for example, is the best in a cereal or if you're going to use fluroxapyr or Group 4 for kosha and cereal, keep that in mind in your other crops or rotations. My point is try to use the best herbicide for the best application timing. Group 1s are typically best on wild oats, but you can't overuse them, example. So try to use the best herbicide for the best weed, but where it makes the most sense. But yeah, some of those oldies but goodies are certainly coming back to the fore and adding the third mix, a tribenuron to a bromoxynil or an MCPA, for example, adding 2,4-D where it makes sense, bromoxynil. So yeah, some of these products that have been around for a long time, they're getting more focused now because of resistance management and trying to keep it at bay.
Mm-hmm. So now Francois Tardis brings up a really good point. Do we have new modes of action in the pipeline for wild oats, or do we have to get creative, which is sort of the theme of tonight, is being clever with our chemistries. I mean, that's to fall back on, we can't always just wait for the next thing in the pipeline. So I think we have to be managing with what we have. But do we know of anything in the pipeline as far as a new mode of action on oats, wild oats? Does anybody want to take that?
I have heard that Bayer may have one in development, but I don't know that for sure. So.
Okay. Maybe. Jeanette, have you heard any rumors? Can you break any news? Oh no, I think she's frozen. Or she's very good at playing statue. It's one or the other. Okay, we'll give her a minute to thaw. It's suddenly much colder in Winnipeg. Okay, well, actually, now is a great time to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to go to our first clip. So this clip, Jay, we're going to pull up clip 1, which is of Peter Sikkema, I believe, yes, and talking about a Twopass system in soybeans, because we've also got Jeanette's also got some great visuals of some of this, and Rob also has some details about tackling some of these pesky weeds in our soybean crop. So while we wait for Jeanette to climb back on here, we'll go to our first clip with Peter Sikkema.
And so water hemp in the trials that we've completed in Ontario, we have 36 experiments that we did over the past 6 growing seasons. The average yield loss in soybean is 43%. However, I do want to stress that in the most competitive environments, the highest yield loss that we documented on a commercial farm in Ontario is 93%.
Wow. Peter, let's talk control strategy here. Based on your research, you've done a lot of it. What are the leading herbicide control options?
Yeah, and so the first point that I would make, Bernard, is that I think if a farmer in Ontario has water hemp on their farm, they should plan to use a Twopass weed control program. And what I mean by that is they should put down their best soil applied herbicide and then be prepared to manage any weed escapes that may occur. In the research that we've conducted in Ontario, herbicides like Bifecta, Boundary, Voltaire, and Authority Supreme, they have provided anywhere from 81 to 84% control on average. And then Triactor and Fierce are the 2 best herbicides, and they provided 90 and 92% control. So then if you're growing identity preserved or Roundup Ready soybean, you could come back with a post-emergence application of Reflex, Blazer, or Hurricane. If you're growing Extend soybean, you could come back with a post-emergence application of dicamba. However, I do want to stress, if you choose to apply dicamba post-emergence, growers have to be really cautious in terms of off-target movement to sensitive crops and adjacent fields. And finally, if you are growing enlist soybean, you can put on a post application of either Liberty or enlist duo to clean up any weed escapes. And in the work that we've done, Bernard, where farmers have used a Twopass weed control program, we're approaching near perfect control of water hemp in soybean in Ontario.
Final question, Peter. What role can best management practices play in helping farmers win that war against water hemp?
Yeah, and I think the first step to reduce the incidence of herbicide resistant weeds in the province, and specifically glyphosate resistant weeds, is farmers need to introduce more diversity into their weed and crop management programs. I think the basis for introducing diversity into your programs is having a diverse crop rotation. And I would suggest that there should be a minimum of 3 crops in the rotation, such as corn, soybean, and wheat. I think that in soybean, you could consider narrow row widths. In addition to that, I think planting cover crops after winter wheat harvest would be a good idea in terms of suppressing the growth of water hemp after harvesting winter wheat to prevent weed seed return to the soil. And I think that Ontario farmers should implement and use multiple herbicide modes of action over time.
Well, we are waiting to hear back from Jeanette. But in the meantime, I did, of course, want to add a quick shout out to our show sponsors tonight. Of course, ADAMA Canada, Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, and Disruptors, an RBC podcast. This fall, it's tackling a critical question: how can Canada help feed the world while simultaneously slashing carbon emissions? This special 3-part series features an array of experts working up and down the food supply chain, including farmers, academics, scientists, and restaurateurs. Listen for The Growing Challenge on Disruptors wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so I'm sorry to Ray DeBenko that no, I do not have the wild turkey hat that Bern had last week. I'll work on that. All right, so while we're waiting for Jeanette to hop back on, we hope she's okay. She's just suddenly disappeared. It's not the first time. Probably won't be the last that a guest has gone missing. But Rob, I want to touch on a few things that Dr. Sycamore mentioned there. He mentions that with the research that they've done in this layering, they get near perfect control of water hemp. Is that the goal? Is that realistic for most weeds? Or is it because it's water hemp, we need to be that precise?
Boy, good question. That's what we strive for, 100% control if we can, and reduce the seed bank. Probably not realistic. We're overall looking for economic weed control, right? Spend the optimum amount of money for minimizing the impact. But that being said, we do want to reduce what goes into the seed bank. Something like water hemp that's so prolific, you're never really going to stop seeds from going into the seed bank and the spread. I think that's the goal, but it's unrealistic to achieve 100%.
So, but it does sort of bring up there in thinking about, well, we may not be able to eliminate every weed. It really isn't necessarily about elimination so much as you mentioned, not letting them necessarily add to the seed bank. So even if weeds are there, if they're not ones that are going to end up adding to the seed bank, we don't need to worry about them. Or in the case of what Peter Johnson likes to bring up, when people are revenge spraying, so they're going after a weed long after it's either set seed or done its damage, how do we sort of change the conversation around revenge spraying?
Yeah, I think a green foxtail that sometimes emerges later because it's a warm season weed, and it'll be a few centimeters tall in a wheat crop that's almost heading out. And I've had growers ask me, "Well, look at all this foxtail. I should be spraying this. Is there anything I can spray this late?" And I'm like, "Well, why?" Ideally, you'd rather not have the seeds go back into the bank, but they're not causing any harm to your yield. You're essentially wasting money this year, and there's an argument for reducing the amount of seeds that go into the bank. but you're also contributing to resistance over the long term if you're doing that revenge spraying. So keep in mind the economic return and what's best for your farm long term. A few weeds or heads sticking out, if they're not really causing a yield impact now, not likely worth spraying. Exceptions to that would be like patch spraying of a resistant patch of wild oats, or a patch that you suspect is resistant. Yeah, you want to get rid of that before it's setting seed, but I wouldn't call that revenge spraying. I'd call that just good agronomic practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Jason Vogt brings up the point with water hemp and Palmer amaranth, which of course has been identified in Manitoba. We have to be that specific. Both dioecious, am I saying that right? Um, and of course germinate well into the fall, and just so many seeds per plant, right? Like something like water hemp does create so many. Kosha is similar though, right? And kosha can set seed even when it's super short, right?
Yep, and redwood pigweed, which is similar to water hemp.
Same. Yep. That all of them can. Yes. So these are things that, so I guess, I mean, this does beg the question. Understanding the weed spectrum is one step of this, right? So we've talked about, just even in passing, we've talked about late emerging weeds, so those that need some heat, so they show up later. We've talked about ones that will germinate or into the fall, or ones that, maybe are typically supposed to wait till spring but don't, and then the overwinter. So the weed spectrum matters, but also the not just what we're targeting, but the growing type of that plant and how it has potentially gotten trickier. Because we do have weeds, right, that are maybe perhaps a little trickier than they used to be.
Yeah, and again, tying it to the crop, what you're growing. Lamb's quarters, for example, again, another very prolific seed setter, relatively easy to control and keep under control in cereals, for example. Quite difficult in pulse crops if it gets ahead of you, or clearfield canola. I remember there's not a lot of clearfield canola left, but you could often see the clearfield canola fields by the lamb's quarters poking out. So you can do a relatively good job in a cereal. So take care of your lamb's quarters the best you can during that cereal year to set up for your following pulse crop, where it's going to be more difficult to control lamb's quarters, for example, in pulses that are less competitive and less options.
Absolutely. Actually, Jay, could you bring up slide number 27 of Rob's? There's a couple really good ones here in a row that really do speak to what we just saw in that clip with Peter Sikkema, with our untreated check, and then so that is near perfect weed control, left to right. Now,
Yeah,
granted, it's
exactly.
untreated versus a mix, but yeah, go ahead, walk us through this, Rob.
Yeah, so a number of examples like this from Peter's work over the years, where 1,000 or more water hemp per square meter and getting near perfect control pre-seed, at least for a few weeks. And again, to his point, you likely have to come back. This is a few weeks after application, come back later on potentially to control the in-crop ones. But combinations like saflofenicil, mazathipir, SMOC. Three groups of action there doing a very good job. Metribuzin, pyroxasulfone, we've seen some very good results. Saflofenicil and metribuzin. So there are some good combinations that are providing very good pre-seed control, and then follow up in crop as necessary. Another one that we're looking at is saflofenicil, metribuzin, and bromoxynil. You get some residual activity from the metribuzin. Soybeans, it's quite tolerant. If you get into the dry beans, you have to be careful on the safety. So it's a matter of how high can we go without hurting the crop. That's another part of the nuance of these combinations and the residual, keeping in mind the crop safety.
Yeah, Jay, can you switch to, I think it's slide 29. So this is, I do want to talk a little bit about where residuals fit in. Um, I think when we have the soybean discussion, at least for Eastern Canada, for Ontario, that's part of the mix. But for Western Canada, have we seen an increase in interest in residual products?
I would say yes. Pulses very problematic for resistant weeds and weed control in general. So we've got some good pre-seed products that provide some residual control. You do have to be careful for your recropping though, because there can be too much residual and it hurts the crop the following year. Metribuzin is an active that we're quite interested in. We sell it in crop now, and we think there's some utility pre-seed that's been not really looked at or underutilized in the past that we're looking at some options. 2021, we saw some really good control and relatively good crop safety. This year, we saw a little bit more injury in lentils. It's not obvious here with the weeds, but when you get into the brown soil zone, like here in southern Alberta, you do have to be careful. If you go too high at the rate pre-seed, we can start to hurt the crop. So again, it's finding that balance. So the residual, great enhancement for some weed control when you don't have great in-crop options. Apply pre-seed, but be careful for the crop safety and the recropping. So it's a balance that we always have to walk that fine line.
Mm-hmm. And our public service announcement, of course, recropping in a dry year, even perhaps trickier. And we've certainly covered that quite a bit, but really important, bears mentioning, you might have to add another year to that recropping restriction.
Yeah, we saw that with Amazamox in 2021, for example. Yeah, our standard
absolutely.
recommendations for a decade, all of a sudden were kind of thrown out the window with the dryness.
Yeah, that's dry, everybody following along. Fleabane, I know that it's not a huge issue at West, but Jason is saying here in Manitoba that fleabane is becoming a bigger issue, certainly a big one here. And so I would say if it isn't an issue yet, just wait, that's a fun one too. Fleabane's awful. So yeah, so is that one you're seeing on your travels, Rob?
Fleabane, just in Ontario. I've seen it in southwestern Ontario.
Okay.
I have not seen it here in Manitoba yet, but I don't get out like Vogt and some of the other guys as much. But if you see it in Ontario and you see it in the Midwest, you're likely going to see it in the Red River Valley, and then eventually it'll spread out from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not a lot of fun, Jason, just so you know. Jason wanted to know if he could get some of the information from Francois Tardis, some of the work he's done. If Francois is not here in the chat anymore, I will connect the two of you and we'll get that connected, because that is what's important. All right, I have checked my email and I have not seen anything from Jeanette. So
she just sent a note that her Starlink is out.
Oh, no, don't.
So
Don't tell me that. I finally have ordered Starlink to fix my terrible internet. And this is what's going to happen. I need a whole new plan, you guys. What am I going to do?
So I don't know if she can phone in, but it sounds like her Zoom is out for now.
Oh, nuts. Okay. All right. Okay, she said she's going to keep trying, so we'll keep rolling. Rob, it's the Rob show tonight. So thank you for hanging in there with me. But that's okay. And of course, any questions that come from the audience, do send them in. We've got lots of stuff to cover tonight. So we'll keep doing that. And Jeanette promises to keep trying. So that's okay by me. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about tank mixing. So we have talked quite a bit about, time of year. So that idea of layering. So we're talking about layering isn't necessarily a herbicide on a herbicide. It's the different times of year and layering control. And so like Peter Sikkema said, go out with your best residual and then go in and deal in crop, sort of that idea. Okay, so Jeanette is texting and sends her apologies. I also apologize. I turned my phone off during this broadcast. And so there have been times where when I sign off for the evening, I turn on my phone and I have a whole bunch of So Jeanette, if you can climb back on, great. And if not, we'll keep going. Okay, so let's talk tank mixing, because this is, of course, another one of the tools that we have, but that comes with it both some pros and some cons, some challenges. One of the things, Rob, that Jeanette wanted to speak to, but I'll ask you as well, do we have mixes that become greater than the sum of their parts? Do we have some really great synergistic effects that we can leverage?
Yes, the best example I can think of off the top of my head is pyrosulfatol and bromoxynil, Infinity. So you put those two actives together, It seems to be 1 + 1 = 3. You don't need the same higher rates as you would applying them individually. So Infinity, I think, is a good example of two different modes of action, two actives that have good synergistic properties or additive properties.
So that's a good. Should we, from an agronomic perspective, expect when we tank mix, if they are partners, tank mix partners, and we've done it right, should we expect the same level of control if we had done them individually? Is that the goal? Is that realistic?
I think the short answer is yes, and there's different aspects to that question. From a resistance management point of view, each active on its own would need to provide acceptable control to be considered a good resistance management practice. That's not always realistic, especially if a weed is resistant or less sensitive to one or the other of the actives. And even the PMRA, for example, will encourage lower rates to minimize pesticide impact on the environment or applications in general. So encouraging lower rates, and you can get that with some of these additive effects. It does beg the question, what is that doing to resistance management? You're reducing the target site selectivity for resistance from a target site aspect, but you're arguably increasing the metabolic resistance probability over time by using lower rates. So from pure weed control benefit or point of view, yes. From a resistance management point of view, much greater.
Mm-hmm. So then there's sort of option C, which would be how prevalent are antagonistic issues, and how do we navigate those?
Well, quite prevalent and different types of antagonism. I think of two types of antagonism. Number one, in the tank, when you have a mixing issue where the products just aren't compatible. And I don't know if you're going to show that video from Syngenta. That was a very good example. But yeah, you can put a couple of products together in the tank and they're just not compatible. That's obviously a disaster that you don't want to happen. And then more commonly, we think of antagonism where one herbicide or pesticide is affecting the performance of another. And many examples of that, but 2,4-D and pinoxidin, for example, will reduce wild oat control with pinoxidin. Bentazone added to imazamox, a good popular mix in pulses or peas and soybeans, dry beans. But if you don't add that nitrogen source like UAN, you'll really start to see your grassy weed control go down from the antagonism caused by the bentazone. So additives can help both for the in-tank compatibility. I think of adding ammonium sulfate to hard water with atralcoxanum, for example. We've seen a few gelling issues if you don't add that ammonium sulfate to atralcoxanum when the water is hard, like over 400 parts per million, for example. And then there's the efficacy antagonism. Can we overcome it by just not using 2,4-D with pinoxidin, for example, or is there an additive like a UAN that can help overcome antagonism when bentazone's added to imazamox?
Now, and that is for the most part focused just on the herbicide side, but of course there's always the question of, well, I'm going across the field, what else can I throw in there? So do you have a rule of thumb as far as, beyond a few additions of perhaps some fertility, do you keep it herbicides are with herbicides and other pesticides go on their own?
Not necessarily. I wouldn't have a hard rule. If anything, I kind of default to it's okay unless proven otherwise from a compatibility or antagonistic point of view. The challenge is we can't do all that testing ahead of time. It's usually, we find out the hard way sometimes that, geez, that boron antagonized the control with imazamox or what have you, because we just don't have the time to test all these combinations in the field. But definitely for in-tank compatibility, do the jar test, look at the manufacturer's websites. ADAMA publishes supported tank mixes that we've tested and know are good, and some to stay away from, and I know the other companies have as well. So there's a lot of sources or resources to help with those questions.
All right, and Rob, you did allude to it, and Ray says, I suspect in Rob's comments there's also the sequence of mixing. So there's a few different ways around this. So we have a clip that I do want to share that we do have an example, and it's a great example of why mixing order matters and compatibility matters. So Jay, if we can go to clip number 2.
Hi, I'm Doug Bauman, a chemist and an engineer with Syngenta Canada, standing here today at the Honeywood Research Facility. I was just asked the question about whether or not tank mix order matters. And the answer is that it absolutely does. You know, in front of me I've got an example, and we just shared it with some of the crowd today, how a simple 3-component mix of Roundup and Trivapro, where Trivapro has 2 components, A and B, that mixture goes from pure and clean when you follow the Wales mixing order, that tried and true acronym that helps us understand how to mix a pesticide. But when you mix that up and you go the other direction, you know, I've got a sieve in front of me right now where not only is there residue on the bottom, but this sieve isn't even draining. And so as a chemist, this is really interesting to me, and it's fabulous. But boy, is it expensive if it was to happen to anybody else. And so what's actually happened here is that the Roundup is an ionic molecule. It goes into suspension as both the Roundup that we know plus a counterion, normally a potassium salt. And what that does, if you add it first, as I have here on my left, is it really changes the water quality and adds to that ionic strength, so that when I add another product, in this case Trivapro A, that is a suspension concentrate, the presence of those ions in solution is what really hurts that Trivapro A, that hurts just about every suspension concentrate there is, and it causes the particles in that to collapse. Because the way that suspension concentrate is built is you have the particle of AI and it's protected by a layer of surfactant. When it then gets added to a solution in the wrong order, that protective layer collapses, and then particle upon particle upon particle, they stick together. Now, it's not a comment on one product or the other, it's a lesson in Wales. To go back to the sample on my right, when you follow Wales and put those products in the correct order, you get the dilution you need. You give the AI particles, the active ingredient particles, the space they need, because when they're further apart in the carrier, and then that collapsing of the protective layer happens, when they're further apart, they don't crash into one another, and you don't get this really unfortunate result that I have on my left. You know, I really don't think that any grower has paid for elbow grease, and I'd love it if when you have a good tank mix, you don't need to use any on the way to the farm and on the way back from the field.
All right, some really good stuff there. Great visual. Before we get to the last part of our show, which is flying along, I did want to, of course, send another thank you to our show sponsors, to ADAMA Canada, to the RBC Disruptors podcast, and of course, to Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture. Decisive Farming, your soil has a unique story. At Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, we get that. Let's optimize your fertilizer costs and replenish your soil by tailoring nutrient plans to your field's needs. Visit decisivefarming.com to learn how to get soil health insights today. All right, so we saw there some of the detrimental effects of putting things in the wrong order. And here's the thing I wanted to quickly expand on is some products are compatible, but only in the right order, and then other products are not compatible at all. And Peter's got a good comment we'll tuck into in a minute. Now, Doug mentions the Wales order. I've always heard Whamlegs. So, Jay, if you could bring up, I think it's slide 32. Did I write? Yeah, slide 32 of Rob. So this is the one I'm familiar with. But this shows that proper mixing order. So, Rob, where does this usually go wrong? Where do we make the biggest mistakes?
Just a quick comment. Whamlegs is essentially Wales, but it adds the micro capsule
Yes.
suspension, which is very uncommon. I can't even think of an obvious example. And it adds the glyphosates, particularly the high-low, but it's the same as whales with those additions. Where does it go wrong? In general, add the hardest to dissolve products first. That's generally what whales or Whamlegs is telling you. It's not black and white, but that's generally it. Water conditioners should be put in at the beginning, like an ammonium sulfate to condition the water before you put in pesticides in general. Trying to think of other examples where it goes wrong. Adding the additive, again, with trilcoxam, I'm a little more familiar with that, but we've had a few examples where adding the surfactant before the trilcoxam has been problematic. So in general, the surfactant should go in at the end. That's another example. And probably the biggest challenge would be if you try to put in a powder or a dry late after you add in these oils and other products, then you try to put in a dry late, it's just not going to dissolve very well. We're less likely to dissolve, and then you can start plugging screens and such. So that's probably the biggest thing is the W, put in those dries first.
Yeah. All right. So Jason's got a question, and Peter also has an observation about antagonism with reduced glyphosate rate. So we'll go to Peter's question in a second. I want to know if there is any work. So Jason Vogt asks, what work, if any, is being done in Canada to look at the benefits of MSOs, so methylated seed oils, being added to herbicides to increase efficiency? What do we know about that, Rob?
Short answer is yes. We're doing a lot of that, not from a particularly academic point of view, but just looking at options. So with the Mazamox, for example, when it first came out, it was with the crop oil concentrate merge. We looked at other options just to provide more options to the user, and we found that MSOs are essentially just as good, within 1% in our trials overall. Non-ionic can be used with the clethodim, for example, but it is not as good. You do really need that oil penetrant, but MSOs often are interchangeable with crop oil concentrates in general. So we're working on a saflufenicil that we're hoping to be registered in the not too distant future, and we expect that label will have, we're applying for that label to have multiple adjuvants, MSOs, non-ionics, crop oil concentrates on it. So yeah, MSOs, good utility there.
Okay, in the pipeline. We'll watch for it there. Good info there, Rob. Okay, so Peter Johnson observes, so back to sort of antagonism and also just what goes on in that spray tank. Peter Johnson says, we've been surprised at antagonism as we reduce glyphosate rates due to price. Always using 1 liter per acre, cut it back, and had issues. So any ideas on why cutting back the glyphosate would have potentially caused an issue?
No, I'm not aware of those specific examples or where Peter's coming from, so can't really comment on that.
I feel like it should work the other way. But so if I think back to the last clip we just watched with the discussion on the glyphosate and the K ions and all that sort of stuff, so if you reduce the glyphosate, there's fewer of them, maybe you needed them? This is my theory.
Well,
Someone go test that.
If I understand the question correctly, I think he's suggesting that 1 liter with other products is controlling weeds fine, but you reduce the glyphosate rate, you're starting to see that it's not working as effectively. Maybe there's some antagonism there that was being masked by the higher rate.
Okay,
could be something there if I understand it correctly, but
okay,
no
yeah. So
experience.
he's saying that glyphosate was antagonized. So realistically, so I guess my question then was, cutting the rate still on label, Peter, or were you being a cowboy? Because and I'm being somewhat facetious, but realistically, it does, to your point, Rob, you used the term that it was masking perhaps some of the antagonism, in that you needed the higher rate to get the efficacy, is what you're saying. So it was actually masking potentially some of that antagonism.
Potentially, yeah. And yeah, Roundup or glyphosate can be used at quite low rates, but of course it depends on the weed and the timing and water volume and all that stuff.
All that. Now we are, yes, Peter says 0.68 is the low label rate. Okay, Peter. It was still on label. It was just the lower rate. I asked this question of many agronomists, Rob. are we past the point of glyphosate going on alone ever?
I wouldn't say ever, no, but I think people should be thinking of tank mixes that make sense. Adding a tribenuron or a 2,4-D just to help control Roundup Ready canola, for example, pre-seed. Obviously, we want to hold on to glyphosate for as long as we can, a great effective part of our toolbox for pre-seed applications. But, if we 20 years ago, we never thought we'd see glyphosate resistance, and unfortunately, it's developed, and more weeds are becoming resistant to it. So we need to do everything we can to prolong that inevitability with other weeds. I think we should be thinking of adding second or third modes of action to glyphosate, as much as it makes sense. You don't want to, again, just recreationally add something, but in most cases, there's likely a need for it, whether it's enhanced dandelion control in the spring or enhanced kosha control or minimizing development of a water hemp or fleabane resistance.
I think we've talked recreational tillage on the show, but I don't think we've ever mentioned recreational tank mixes. So that one's yours, Rob. That's a gold star for you.
I may want to take it back, but okay.
No, you can't. It's live. No, no. I think you're bang on that. Realistically, it every pass needs a plan, right? There should be a purpose of why you're going and what's in the tank. So Peter also saying a lot of cover crop oats this fall got taken out with glyphosate only. So that's a specific case where realistically probably a decent use, a low risk application. So yeah, I would say that. Kevin asked, where can a
Another one.
guy? Oh, go ahead.
Just real quick, another one. I don't know how much pre-harvest glyphosate is used anymore, but in a lot of cases, you would not add anything to glyphosate pre-harvest for quackgrass control, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Just watch your PHIs and make sure that the elevator will still take it. Also, okay, where can a guy find a water hardness meter? So I guess to expand on that question, how important is it to start with testing your water?
I would say that some herbicides or pesticides in general are more susceptible or sensitive to the amount of hardness than others. Like glyphosate's a good example where hard water will reduce the efficacy. Trocoxidum I mentioned already. You get over 400 parts per million, we recommend ammonium sulfate. There's many examples out there. To actually get a water hardness meter, I don't know offhand. Maybe some of the people on the line, tonight could help out, but I can't tell you offhand.
I'm going to say not PV Mart and maybe Amazon, but I don't actually know. But PV Mart never has anything you actually need, and Amazon has everything. So try there. But yes, if there are other
the
people,
labs, the labs like A&L and that'll help, but you hate to have to send away a sample.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we are winding down here, and Rob, I will say a big thank you for taking on this whole show basically on your own. So I do appreciate it. Not that I gave you much choice, but there you go. And too bad we missed Jeanette. We'll have to have her back. But Rob, I do know you have another event you have to get to. So I do thank you very much for squeezing us in this evening. Just quickly, Peter says on the MSOs, some recommendations are to add them even where no COC or surfactant is required to get improved control. So in your work with MSOs, where do you stand on that, Rob?
Good question. I guess I don't have experience adding an adjuvant where we didn't think, one was recommended or required. So far in our studies, we've looked at using an MSO instead of a COC or with a new combination that we weren't sure if it needed an additive or not. So we throw in an MSO or COC or others to test. But nothing jumps out where we've used it just to see where, I don't know, what's an example where you currently don't normally use an additive. Although that being said, glyphosinate's on a lot of people's radars now, including ours. And I will comment that we did see one good instance this year where we did add, it was actually a COC, but an adjuvant, and it did enhance the activity of glyphosinate in a pre-seed situation. So there's an example where you don't normally think of adding an additive to a product, and it did help. So I'm sure there are examples like that.
Okay. All right. We're learning. I like it. Okay. All right. I will wind down a few minutes early so Rob can get to his next event. But I want to thank you very much, Rob, for joining us tonight. This was my head's a little full. I'll be honest. That was a lot, and I really appreciate it. So thanks so much for sharing all that with us.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And of course, thank you to everyone who joined us in the comments. Some great questions, some great discussion. And I hope that for those of you who are looking for more information, if you can't connect, let me know. We will be back, of course, next week, Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern, right here. Big thank you again to all of our sponsors, ADAMA Canada, Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, and RBC's Disruptors podcast. And yes, Ray, I got to tell you, I like chemistry, so this was a lot of fun. And yeah, okay, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow. Get those CU credits, and we will see you next week right here, 8 p.m. Eastern. Cheers, everybody.